Hello. I think we all would like to be happy in life. Is that right? I am 61 now, have struggled with this question my whole life, how best to be happy. And it strikes me there are some phrases we've heard, but they don't always seem implementable to me, like love is the answer. Did that come from the 1960s? Or positive unconditional regard, or be a good Samaritan, or just do what's right, or act upon your heart. Now, there's a psychologist who passed away, about age 40? Sean Stephenson. And he talked about spending time lecturing in prisons. He had an excellent YouTube video given from a prison. And he said, everybody in prison wants to be loved, and that's a given, he said. And the Christian scriptures say, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Whatever that might mean exactly. And I mentioned a minute ago the Christian idea, and maybe in some other faiths too, of being a good Samaritan as a sign of being loving. And what would that generally mean? Helping someone in need, it's said. And how? Typically we think by giving to charities or someone on the street corner who needs money, hopefully for the best uses or somewhat. Now, I'll give a couple examples of people I have seen, I believe, above average in what we might call this approach love. And as one man put it too, I loved watching, he said he puts in the love bank and hopes later in time to come back and withdraw from it in old age. So let me think here of a few people as examples. Now, we've all heard, of course, of Johnny Cash, the singer. You might say in certain respects activist, but I think especially of videos I've seen of him singing in prisons, Folsom Prison in particular. And he did several things I think quite notable. First, many people might feel too frightened to do something in a prison setting. It was said there were murderers there, so to speak. But he went there anyway. He never spent time in prison, but he had been arrested a number of times himself, I believe, or come close to it. So, interestingly, people loved him there, the quote prisoners, wanted him back all the time, and the word spread on the grapevine, Johnny Cash is okay. Well, what did he do for them exactly? Did he help them make more money? No. I think he did something quite notable. He helped them feel respect for themselves. And that wasn't a giving of anything per se in a charitable sense, other than helping them reframe aspects of themselves that were called criminal by society. He helped them get their self-esteem better in perspective, better self-esteem, better self-respect, if you will. And if you think back, when was it? I don't know. When there were duels, if you, quote, had insulted someone, they'd say, well, I want to have a duel with you. Pistols at 50 or 100 feet. We're going to settle your insult to my honor. But what was then an insult to honor other than a feeling of lack of self-respect conveyed to somebody? And this being very hard for many to get over or process. Now, everyone would like to think they have a moral code that is the most loving. There's a man, for instance, Fletcher, who wrote a book, Situation Ethics, and he said, just do what you feel like is loving, and it will be loving. And if you love people, that will make everything go peachy keen, or the best possible. But again, I keep asking over the years, what is love? And especially since I had a certain upbringing, a grandmother and mother born in eastern Poland near Ukraine. My mother came to Ellis Island at age 12, knowing no English, unfortunately. And when she married at 20, she and her husband almost immediately became missionaries in the Plymouth Brethren Church. Somewhat similar to the Amish Mennonites, that sort of thing. I'd also say then several examples from some favorite movies of mine that I love. And let's see if I can remember a few here. Well, we've probably all heard of Jack Nicholson and Diane Keaton. They were together, for instance, in a movie, Something's Gotta Give. And Jack Nicholson in the movie had had a heart attack while at her home dating her daughter. And the mother was not amused. He was dating the daughter, who was quite young. And when he had a heart attack, it was either go to a hospital or something or stay at her place and recover. And she was quite bitter about the ironic situation. But then at one point, about midnight, they were going to have a little get together in the kitchen and make pancakes. And Diane Keaton in the movie asked him, I can't understand if you hate me or you're the first person ever to get me. And he said, I don't hate you. And that really got me thinking, amongst other things. What was so special to her to realize that just perhaps there was something unusual about this man, at least in the portrayal in that movie, whereby he got her, whatever that meant. It wasn't thus he was going to help her make great pancakes and at a great cost or do anything financially for her, but that just possibly he got her. Now I know too, Erich Fromm, he wrote The Art of Loving, and he had mentioned, amongst other things in the book, that many people never meet someone with the capacity to love them or love, and that, then love them. So how could that possibly be when we have so many people giving charity and trying to love? Is there something so hard about loving? Do we thus have a primary misconnect here on what love is? That's a question then I've had and I've struggled with my whole life. Now, there have been plenty of activists too through the years, through the decades, millennia, who love to speak what they say is truth. Socrates, for instance, died for his version of telling the truth. But you have to wonder, is telling the truth the ultimate in love? For, in my opinion, many people, I'm not going to say what percentage I believe personally, believe they're doing great things by telling truths. Truths about how some people end up with the short end of the stick, it might be said, or truths about how, so-and-so suffered abuse or oppression or what have you, what labels you want to put on that. But does that alone convey the totality of truth and an effort to help people be loving, so to speak? Or can we actually be sometimes wanting to tell truths that seemingly would help some, and yet at the same time the words we use or a certain concept behind not be helpful, and thus start a movement, end a slavery of a sort, and yet in a manner that is not going to perpetuate because the people on the other end of the stick feel clubbed over. And what is the common element then? I think it's a lack of respect as per how the message is conveyed in a certain essence that Johnny Cash got spot on. And what was that, I believe? He understood where they were coming from. He understood what it was like to walk in their shoes. And this is something that I think we can all wrap our heads around, but it's easier said than done by far to understand what it's like to walk in someone's shoes. Now, for those of a Christian persuasion, perhaps, they might find very interesting a book, The Purpose-Driven Church, by Rick Warren. And he had pointed out he's counseled at least 22,000 pastors over the years. And his main point in the book, I think, if I would sum it up, is that many, many pastors don't understand but a smidgen of their flock that they want to, quote, minister to or whatever. Help, love, make money off of for themselves and their families, what have you. But they don't understand but a smidgen, tiny smidgen of their area. And others too who say, be a content provider or creator, say, niche down because you only understand a small segment anyway. So I would suppose no matter how great a product, if you only understand a certain little niche of audience, because that's the niche you were raised in and had most exposure to, and know all the little goody secrets about, then I guess you're quite limited. But then who understands a whole panoply, a whole sphere of types of people the most? That's a very good question, I think. Sometimes we might think it's particularly actors and actresses from my personal experience. Often they've had little or no college, but a lot of school of hard knocks and other associated experiences. And I can't guarantee this thing about how much college, for instance, but lots of observing goes on outside of a college setting. I do know that. And I've seen some videos to that effect about certain philosophers urging us to observe more. Schopenhauer, for instance, being one of them. And there's also a great book I once read and saw a video on, written once 100 years ago by a former minister, newspaperman, lawyer, Every Man His Own University. And I'm not going to harp about college, no college, some college, but to say I believe observing is very important. And it might not be known to a lot of people, for instance, that Jack Nicholson basically was handed over to his grandparents or grandmother for raising early on. I'm not sure that he knew that, too, for a long time in life. And she brought him up in a setting of a hairdresser, and people were coming and going all day long around him. He was in that milieu. Also, the great actor Clint Eastwood, who said in one movie, you have to know your limits. I think, as Harry Callahan, his father was what you might call a working class man. In the 30s, had run a gas station. And we also like, if a Christian, T.D. Jakes. How many know he came from West Virginia originally? His father was a janitor, but an unusual janitor of a sort. He had a stable, so to speak, of 50 janitors working for him at one time. So that, again, very interesting. Others learn about people from their own struggles or those right around them. Johnny Cash lost, for instance, a brother who was, 14 or something in a sawmill accident or something, cutting. That promoted a lot of struggle. Also the book Jonathan Livingston Seagull, which really took off through the roof, sales-wise and otherwise. A very seemingly simplistic little book. Sold, umpteen million copies. Richard Bach wrote it. We don't typically know he lost a brother also when he was in childhood. I think off the top of my head, the brother fell off a roof. Now, things like this will always prompt us to question, what's the meaning of it all, if you wanted to use the word meaning. And Viktor Frankl then talking about his time in a concentration camp, 3 years, I believe. And he created this idea called logotherapy and meaning, trying to make sense of it all, his suffering and those he saw around him. And then there was Nick Nolte. We all love Nick Nolte, right? Down and Out in Beverly Hills. Oh, many other movies too. Prince of Tides. How many of us know, I didn't until a year ago, watching a podcast episode about a memoir he came out with a few years ago. Fascinating. I didn't listen to the whole memoir, quite lengthy, but an hour and a half show was fascinating about the book and him. He sold draft cards illegally at one point in time and suffered dearly for it with a felony conviction that was maybe suspended or something. That was such a difficult thing for him, finding work afterward and dealing with the aftermath. And that made him have to become what you call, I think, a better man to hang in there and make anything, quote, monetarily or otherwise out of his life. Quite interesting. Now, I just watched a video by a man, Simon Sinek. He's from Britain, I believe, originally, or still. He wrote like a book, Know Your Why. Very popular man in certain circles. And in a video I watched today about him, keynote speech, he said, what we all want is to be around people with the same values and, the same interests. Okay, to clarify, I see in my notes I had written down his key ideas is the same values and same beliefs. If you're around those people, you're going to feel empowered, motivated, and so on, and that you should wear or otherwise have symbols to show to others and identify in them that you have those similar values and beliefs. Very interesting idea. But you just have to wonder, is there something even more? Is there something even more here to this whole thing of what we most want, other than just to be around people who are just like us? Is that all we want in life? Or is there something more yet that we all crave and want? And if I didn't mention already, I'm hinting along the lines of being understood, being recognized for who we are. And if I didn't mention already, I watched a video a month or two ago by a Dr. Gottlieb. It sounds like a German name. I don't know for sure. My mother grew up speaking German in the home, in Poland and so on. So I have a certain understanding of German, living in 3 years in Germany also. But at any rate, Dr. Gottlieb, we might want to check her out. She has things on the internet and otherwise on relationships. And her key point early on is the number one thing in relationships, for healthy with relationships, whatever, is understanding others. And then a minute later, she used the word to get somebody. I brought that up just a few minutes ago. Understanding and getting, said by Diane Keaton in that movie, Something's Gotta Give. And apparently that's not that common. So, if we say, well, what is most important to me is to be understood, to be gotten, I think we have a key word that subsumes this. We call it being respected. And then in the past, he doesn't respect me. Let's have a duel. We call it my honor being insulted. There being, for instance, even wars that go on for generations between nations. Why? Because one nation felt insulted by the other nation, perhaps. I even happen to believe we ourselves have fought wars because we felt insulted. We didn't feel understood, or we felt someone was telling us that we're something that we're not, and we didn't like that. We wanted to set the record straight, at least in our own minds. And then there's Brené Brown. Many of us may have heard of Brené Brown. She says she has done research on shame for decades. And I suppose my perspective would be shame can be quite corrosive. And sometimes we grow up under much shame in childhood or guilt. There's a Dr. Shaler, for instance, who talks about how easy it is for us to be manipulated by people who can make us feel guilty when it's inappropriate. Feel guilty in the sense of someone telling us we're not loving when we want to think we are, or what have you, such that we lose self-respect for each other or think others have also in their eyes, or a combo. Of course, then the flip side also applying, I think, that we all love people who love themselves in the sense of accepting themselves, I think. Maybe we can't put that into words oftentimes, but we sense it. Maybe we say, oh, they have a lot of great self-confidence, or they like themselves as they are. For instance, we all love the movie Twins with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito, or a number of people. Some would say, well, how can Danny DeVito, short and a little chubby, shall we say, be so well loved? I would say because he accepts himself so well for who he is. He respects certain things about himself. And isn't that then a very difficult thing for those females, especially of a certain ethnicity or race in our country today, and with Hollywood out there, who get a few wrinkles or maybe a bump here and there, or a little extra few pounds or more. The issue in my mind being, can the person accept this and who they are in general? If they can't, that is going to be communicated to others in certain ways and not be considered the essence of beauty, actually. If you want to talk about Danny DeVito as being beautiful in the sense of self-acceptance. And then again, the flip side being accepting others. Did I mention the term unconditional positive regard, or what, we always wonder, well, what does that mean exactly? We might also wonder then, well, does that give people carte blanche to be who they are without making any effort to change and just saying, well, I can't help who I am. You're just going to have to accept it or move on. Then the flip side being here, the additional part of understanding people and getting them or whatever, being, well, why can't they easily change or change certain things at all? It's kind of a dual package there. To understand someone as how they walk in their shoes, how they got there, but also the second part, why can't they change their shoes or parts of who they are very easily, if ever? What gives there too? It's a two-part combo. So, we might then say, oh, I understand he had such a terrible childhood, or, quote, they were so, quote, abused or oppressed or got the short end of the stick, but. Why don't they change once they see their problems? Why don't they go to rehab? Why don't they go to therapy? Why don't they, quote, take their, quote, meds? Why don't they, in the ultimate sense, get their act together and stop doing what they're doing that we can see is messing up their lives? Well, I can tell you, having spent some time, considerable time, with what we call addicts of the chemical nature, 5 years spent helping a lot of people in a drop-in center several days a week. And at least one person on a very extensive level who struggled for years with, quote, alcoholism, that it ain't that easy to change. And the so-called approved solutions may be somewhat helpful, but not a good solution overall in the long term, especially by a mile. Hence, Russell Brand in England, former actor and, shall we say, quote, alcoholic and drug user, I believe, in the past, having been quite disconcerted to see only 1 in 10 people who wants treatment in a center, so to speak, can get in. And those coming out often are very disconcerted that they have a new, what they claim, addiction, being to methadone now. And in our country, perhaps some other types of, quote, drugs or, quote, medications too, along with associated stigmas and the impact. So it not being as easy as it sounds. So simply to say, oh, you don't understand me, to me is a two-part thing. A lot of people may not understand how a person got a certain way, but they may also triply not understand why can't things appreciably or completely change and they become like we are. Or they, quote, get their act together then as we define it to be. So I think the upshot of what I'm talking about has been captured so well by a few people throughout humanity. And we may have a gut feeling for who they are and why, we may call them our favorite actors, our favorite actresses. I could give some examples, but at any rate, many of us like Danny DeVito. Many of us like Jack Nicholson. Some not, though. Many of us like Robert Redford. Many of us, if you were to look into some Buddhist thinking, love a John Brahm, a Buddhist who heads up a monastery in Australia. He has gone to New York City, LA, for instance, on lectures, and he's mobbed by crowds. After book signings, he can't get away for an hour and says, I have to go to the restroom, and people follow him in even there. And is taken to wearing a wig lately, I believe. And when he lectures in prisons all across the world, prison officials say everybody who listens to his lectures in prison never comes back, generally speaking. Those of hearing lectures from someone else do come back, and they all say, as prison officials, we want only a John Brahm to come back and lecture. He also says, too, many psychologists and psychiatrists are mimicking some of his thoughts 5 years later. He has no degree, by the way, in psychology, but a degree in theoretical physics from Cambridge, England, after which point he gave up teaching in that area after a year and went to the jungles with his guru, or whatever you want to call him, training leader, for 10 years in the forests before going to Australia, where he found it very hard for 2 years and getting taken seriously, but then things took off from there. So, those people. Maybe a lot of us like Arnold Schwarzenegger too. Pluses and minuses. The man struggled greatly in childhood from a father who was a police chief in Austria, who was what you might call disrespectful in saying Arnold wasn't his seed. And Arnold had to live with that and tried to prove himself and more, and come to America to start over. When they wanted to see him stay there and learn how to yodel, basically, and be another police chief or police officer, what have you. Quite a struggle there. So the man had to really bust his gut and change. And I think a lot of us, regardless of politics or his mode of living in certain ways, loved how he had a lot more respect than average for the fellow man. At least that's my read on it. And a few others through history, but not that many. And we might say Gandhi might have been one of them too. The rest, well, they had a lot of great things, I think, to say about how best to live or what injustices were going on, but certain key factors in this understanding where they were coming from, along with why it's so hard to change, appreciably, seem to me to be the two key elements here. And if you want to wrap that up in the word showing respect or being respectful, that's fine with me. Only in my mind, it's not so much what you're going to show or even believe, but can other people perceive that you perceive them differently? In other words, my final point on this being, can we help someone else feel, even as Brene Brown had said it, that they did the best they can? Maybe she said that in a video I watched with Russell Brand when they were talking one time. And the topic came up that, what was that phrase I just said? You did the best you could. Do we understand thus why it is so hard to change, basically? Not just they had a bad childhood, so that's who they are up to this point. Now, I'll kind of wrap this up with a couple final thoughts. Brene Brown has talked to him. She said, well, if you be more vulnerable, people will understand where you're coming from, what you went through, and maybe why you can't change, I would add. She doesn't focus much on that, I believe, why you can't change very easily. But at any rate, I suppose the biblical scriptures would say, well, it's because we're sinners, not gods. So what do you expect? We can't become gods, of course. So that's, you expect us to change and become gods, perfect? We're going to have to accept we're flawed. Something's holding us back. well, I'm not going to talk about a religious point of view or not, or my views exactly. I'm kind of a mutt in that department, actually, in the religious sphere. A little bit here, a little bit there. But at any rate, I think that's something to consider, that simply, quote, being vulnerable, well, hey, then people could walk in our shoes, right? But then why can't a lot of us be vulnerable? Why, for instance, in my neck of the woods, a working class neighborhood where neighbors of mine are covered with tattoos, or they just got out of the clink, so to speak. One man drove up several months ago in a car and started yelling to his wife, "I'm not going back to prison again." Well, how come in certain neighborhoods you will not hear that, and you don't know anything about your neighbors, including how they earn or get their money, what their children are up to at all? We don't know the slightest thing. It's in the sense of a totally different way of living in terms of a great, quote, facade on the outside, lipstick I might call it, and in combination with everything else coming out on a need-to-know basis. So why this secrecy? Why this need-to-know basis? For instance, the psychoanalyst of note from the 1920s, Karen Horney, having said in one book, she talked about idealized images, but she didn't say everybody uses idealized images. She kind of conveyed that's what we all do, but I know that's not what all people do. Why is it so hard to understand people? Certain people? Well, because they don't want you walking in their shoes, perhaps. And yet they might say, well, you don't understand me, and yet I'm not going to tell you anything except on a need-to-know basis. You have to ponder, well, why would that be? Why wouldn't someone want you to know who they are? Thoughts come to my mind, a couple of them. One person having said, I'll try and remember the name, that they don't want to put anything in writing. It's there forever. I think I heard a couple people say that recently, either in video or whatever. And two, in the movie Notting Hill with Julia Roberts and Hugh Grant, she was very disconcerted at one time when she was captured for her boyfriend or someone she was staying with, Hugh Grant. He was captured in his underwear, answering the door by paparazzi with photographing him. And she said, you don't understand, this will be a bad reflection on me forever. People will dig this up on me forever in print. And now we would say, well, on the internet. And we would say, oh, that'll hurt my career prospects for life. Or Robert Downey Jr. having had to answer on a video once his views in the past that perhaps had shifted. And it was being said, well, that's who you were before in print or on video. It haunting us seemingly for life, hampering us, supposedly impacting our reputation, our impact for earning, even possibly going to prison. So many people say, well, I can't say a word about the inner life of me, or it might hugely impact me and my family. And yet Brene Brown saying, on the other hand, well, if you don't be vulnerable, no one will know who you are. And you're not going to get anywhere in life. You're going to have everything very superficial. How can you have it both ways? Can we really have it both ways? Can we be understood, our flaws, and why maybe we can't fix some of them or all of them? Our values, our beliefs, as Simon Sinek said. Is there something that transcends this? Even, say, if you, quote, got a black mark, as some would say, coming out of, quote, prison, coming out of a, quote, rehab facility, having had a charge against you they call a sex charge, or a, quote, charge of being, quote, mentally ill, or a few other things like that. How do you transcend something like that? Now, some would say, as Grant Cardone did, he once having gone to rehab, well, I'll write a $50 million check and get a jet, and then that's how I prove I've changed. Or he said, alternatively, get yourself a castle. Either being so hard, both being so hard for most to pull off that that's a sure sign you've got something going for you, most don't. And one man spending 27 odd years in prison for cocaine, Michael Santos, said, I'll reform my image also after getting out. I wrote a couple books. I got married while in prison, and I made $1 million lickety split within 2 years, and that's how I prove. But it seems to me there is one last look at this. One last look. And that last look is to be something that very few can do. Robert Redford in a movie once, what was it? The Undiscovered Life with Morgan Freeman. I'm trying to dig up the exact title in my mind. At one point he had said to his daughter or granddaughter, I expect everyone you bring to my house, you treat them with respect. And again, respect being in my book the simplest definition, understanding why someone is who they are and why it's so hard for them to change if they know their flaws. So, I mean, it may sound a little simplistic, but I've watched this movie. The Old Man and the Gun, was it? Robert Redford, where he plays a bank robber. And everybody has to say, he was such a gentleman as he robbed us. He was so kind. They're flabbergasted with the combination. And it's a whole movie made then. Once again, this attitude. And Robert Redford, not everyone knowing man they call an activist of a sort for the environment. I don't know the exact specifics. And having started Sundance as per helping in the film direction, for instance. And, you know, once again, it sounds so simplistic. Jack Nicholson, he has had his struggles over the past. I'm not sure now. I can't say anything with definitude here, but with drugs, alcohol, who knows what, and other variety of things. But there's something I suppose everyone would say, he is Jack. And there's something different about the man, perhaps, just perhaps. And that is that he has, perhaps at least on film, sometimes conveyed, he understands where people are coming from a bit above the average bear. At least that's my perception, along, I suppose, with why it's so hard to change. So, you know, everybody can go down to the local, who knows where, and get a bag of free groceries if they need it. Everybody can get, quote, welfare of a sort if they need it. Everybody may be appreciative of someone writing a check to a charity that in turn might help them at times. We all also might like a smile or a pat on the back or friendly greeting. But how often is it that someone can really understand why we are who we are, especially if we're in a smaller minority setting, in terms of something or another holding us back, or maybe even moreover, why is it so hard to change when they say, well, just go to therapy, just get on your meds or get back on your meds, just fly straight, just play according to the rules and everything would be peachy keen. Well, I suppose in my life and everything I've seen up to now, I'd say it ain't that easy. And that's not the way it really works. The quote-unquote help may have great intentions, but it might fall a little short after that. So, you know, the upshot of the upshot of the upshot, I can tell you I've seen at least one person in my life who might not appreciate certain aspects of certain actors or actresses in the moral sense. Certain, maybe their religious views don't jive, or maybe their mode of sexuality doesn't jive with theirs. Something or another doesn't jive. And yet, I've seen when these people have a hard day, what do they want to do? They want to watch the person who respects them the most, who understands them thus the most. And all this stuff about, oh, they don't agree with my moral code, they don't agree with my beliefs, my values, my sexuality, and how it is expressed and lived out. that seems at least temporarily to go right out the window, because what it is, I think we all, at least temporarily from time to time, most want and is most hard to get is a combination, I'll say it for the billionth time, of someone understanding why we have our flaws and why they're so hard to fix. Simply for someone to say, well, this is your flaw, why don't you fix it? Why do you keep doing the same thing over and over if you know what you're doing wrong or is offensive? Begs the whole point of why it's so hard to fix or change, especially if it's a flaw that is not commonplace in your group or society or in the present era. And, that gives hope to us then, I think, all of us. Not all of us are gorgeous. Not all of us are young. I remember seeing the other day on Green Renaissance Channel a woman, she described herself as 4 years short of 90. And she said it bugged her that she didn't have smooth skin, amongst other things. But she was still quite happy in life. And seems to me we all have flaws. Maybe the flaws are so typical amongst our friends that they're not considered flaws, but we all have them. And all of us struggle one way or another with wanting something more than we have. And this is my take then, at least at present, not with certitude. I could be wrong about certain things, but that's my take on what we most want, at least from time to time, after our basic needs are taken care of. Maybe even possibly before all of our basic needs are taken care of, and that's why some people upped and fought in World War II, knowing they might not come back or come back maimed. There was something more important even than our basic needs being met. It was to be understood by some people so we didn't feel ashamed of who we are, and that we could hold our heads high. I like that phrase as a parting thought from Les Brown, a motivational speaker who went through very difficult times earlier in life. And he said, hold your head high, amongst other things, in a video. So that my mind being self-respect, understanding why we have the flaws we do and why it's so hard to change them. Why we might not even want to put forth the effort to try to. Is it the biggest bang for the buck? For that matter. Again, those are my thoughts then as to what might make us most happy, what we're most changing. And it isn't simply as easy to say as, love others and love yourself, or be more, just do the right thing and people will love you, or find those who you're most simpatico with as to beliefs and values. My thoughts on the matter at present anyway, and I wish you well.